Oh, wow.
We just made fireworks happen. Okay. Thank you for staying. And so with that, take it away, Matt.
Okay, I have a super scripted version of this, but I'll try to be a little bit more unscripted. But, okay, we're going to talk over through the Clobber verses in the Bible. This is going to be a little more extensive than the 6 that are usually covered, but because we're going to go into the transgender issues as well. Mostly be going on some books I've read on the topic. Before I begin, I'm not a pastor, so I kind of made it a little dry, but and this talk I'm going to attempt to demonstrate there is an affirming that God is affirming to LGBTQIA individuals. I also feel that we should assume that God is acting in a kind and affirming way unless proven otherwise. Okay, so we're going to start in Genesis. This is Adam and Eve. This is right at the beginning. One particular sticking point for some people about this is for, especially for transgender issues, but also homosexuality as well, is Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So, okay, so there are these two categories, right? Male and female, men and women. And so the argument here is, well, there's nothing in between. You can't be a man, a woman who thinks like he wants to dress up like a man, or a man who has attracted to other men, or anything like that. And the problem with this in the Pentateuch, the first 5 of the books of the Bible, other places, there are clearly exceptions to these clear categories. The Pentateuch likes to have clear categories. For instance, like in the first day of creation, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God said that the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness, and God created the light, called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And so there's this other thing like light and dark, day and night, but the problem with this is that there's twilight. And he doesn't talk about the twilight. He just says there's light and darkness. It's this kind of chiaroscuro world. And that's obviously not the way the world is. There's twilight. And then on the 3rd day, he divided the land from the sea, and the sea was dry land, and the sea was where the water was. But there's obviously things that aren't that way. There's bogs and even rivers and swamps and lakes. And so there's all these places where there aren't clear categories. And so it seems kind of invalid to say that just because there's these man and woman that there aren't things that are kind of in between, because when he talks about other stuff that seems to be these clear categories, there's actually stuff that's in between.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
so,
very good.
Great stopping point. Any reflections, thoughts, questions?
When I was a kid, it did always confuse me when he's talking about God created man in his own image. And it's like, well, there's man and woman, and, well, which one is he then? And it's like, is he both? If he is both, well, then there's all this talk about the issues against transsexuals and such. They're basically being both. They're probably closer to that image in this connotation than one who is binary one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's a good point.
It's also interesting to know, as Ash reminded me, thought it was hilarious when I said that the people who wrote the Bible were not gynecologists. Well, they weren't biologists either, in that biologists are starting to just pay attention to the animal world and realizing that our sense of male and female does not exist in any clear binary in the actual creation of the world, that it's so hard to define, and some animals will literally go back and forth. If there's not enough males, the female animals will spontaneously switch to males. There's a fish that can inseminate its own eggs and then go back. It can switch. So even though we don't have the biological ability to just on command switch, the point is that the vast array of creation it is not necessarily put in the Bible because it didn't need to be. That's not what's important, is to document every scientific truth. But for those for whom the Bible is a stopping point, it's good for us to talk about. It never was intended to be a biology book, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sure. All right, should we do the next one?
All right. The other passages in the creation story that people fall back on is Genesis 2:23-24. In fact, Jesus himself quotes this. We'll get into that later. Okay. And then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. And they shall become one flesh." Okay, so the argument here is that, this is actually kind of a Greek idea too, but that because the man had something missing taken out of him, and then he's not complete until he's with the woman, and because he had his rib or his side taken out of him. And so that's kind of the argument here, and that's actually part of Greek mythology too. There's a couple problems here. The first is that he never intended. He healed up immediately. God healed up the flesh immediately after the rib was taken out of the man. So that's not in. And the point of the story, and then also the animals, like the animals, they are not missing parts. Like God didn't go to earlier in the story, God goes to the animals in the garden and he tries to find them as companions to the man. But he doesn't do the same thing with the animal, take out a part of the animal, but yet they're fine being male and female. And the point of the story actually seems to be that the woman is like the man, because he says, "This at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And that it actually seems to be more that it's her similarity to the man that's important, which is why the animals can't be suitable companions. Than that it's that she's different than the man, or that she's a missing part of the man. It's actually that she's like the man.
If I understand this correctly, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, people might quote this verse to say, that's why you can't have two men, because a woman completes a man.
Yeah.
Or you can't have, right, that they're meant to be complementary. And yet that wasn't necessarily the intention of the story. The story was Adam was lonely, and God made someone very much like him who was of the same level, kind of intellectually and emotionally. So it's the companionship that's important, not the difference. It's the similarity.
Why would the people who wrote the Bible or whatever, does this come from? Is this similar to another creation story in their world?
Probably is.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking. That.
I think the snake has some sort of importance, like mythology.
Oh, a lot. That's
Yeah.
a whole really cool
Yeah.
topic. It doesn't have to do with gender so much, but yeah, no, I think it's interesting for us to know the verses people will use to shut down the
Yes.
argument. To say, well, that's the end of the story. And the truth is, all of these different verses have so much history and meaning and metaphor to them that they can never mean just one thing. So, do you want to go on to the next big one here?
Yeah, okay. Last passage in Genesis I wanted to discuss was Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, as a side note, it's kind of interesting that they actually think they found the site of Sodom in archaeology now. Yeah. But regardless, the point of this passage actually seems to be lack of hospitality. Even if there was some sodomy going on, call it in the Genesis story, immediately before Abraham is told the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, he's greeted by three mysterious visitors whom he breaks his back to accommodate. And so his generosity towards the visitors seems to be kind of a foil to or a counterpart to the lack of hospitality in Sodom. And I should say, I looked this up a little bit. Lot was actually had been staying in Sodom for a long time. He was considered a native there at that point. And so it seems to be the point is that the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, their problem is that they wanted to kind of control the visitors to the town, because hospitality is such a big deal at that point in history, and they did not accommodate them. And there's also Jude 7, which people don't talk about very much, but it is kind of an interesting. Where it refers to them pursuing strange flesh, but actually in Jude 7, the word for strange flesh is heteros, which actually and it seems to be so it probably doesn't mean homosexual, because they actually use the Greek word heteros. Which means the flesh of the visitors to the town. And again, there was sexual immorality going on, but the point was barbaric cruelty to the visitors. And like I said in the temple talk, there are several passages that allude to this in the Old Testament, that they don't seem to be suggesting that Sodom and Gomorrah that was their principal problem.
I remember hearing that it was really offensive to gay people when you read the description of basically gang violence with no regard for the other person, and then follow up, you have Lot, who offers his daughter up to this mob.
To save the stranger.
Right.
To save the angel.
Yeah, to save the angels. It doesn't matter if they're men, women, whatever. It's a brutality. It's sexual assault.
Yeah.
And to somehow equate that with gay people or same-sex relationships is deeply offensive, because anyone who's been assaulted in any way knows that is a clear difference from the actual intention of what sexuality is meant to be. So that's another piece to look at. You're going to say something.
So, and yeah, I always just assumed that all that they were telling me growing up was that it was sodomy and such that they were talking about. As you mentioned of Jude, it sounds like then you mentioned gang violence. It sounds like there was some human trafficking going on, basically, and the sexual assaults on them, which that is.
Completely different.
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
hugely different, and basically turned the gay community into the scapegoat for what was really going on.
Destruction.
Yeah.
It's just
Right?
terrible.
God's
Right.
Perhaps
wrath.
extreme xenophobia perhaps was going on.
I feel like that community there was, it turned into dog eat dog.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
had totally lost it in that way.
Yeah.
And so, God kind of had to start over a few times.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on National Geographic, they had a story about they found the city that they think was Sodom, and the man there said they feel it was an asteroid that hit.
Did it?
If you see anything coming from the sky like that, of course you're going to say it was God,
Yes.
and we must have done something wrong
Yes.
to justify this judgment. So who knows? Maybe this is partially a story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of that happens, you interpret your life backwards.
Yeah.
You look back and go, oh, I think God was doing this and God was doing this. And that probably happened a lot in the Bible.
If something that horrible happened to a city, actually be obliterated by a meteor strike or something like that, I could see the stories having been embellished over time of how bad they were to justify something that awful happening to the town.
See, nothing of a unique. I mean,
Yeah.
they didn't have anything like that in those days. They basically get nuked by an asteroid.
No, they were so awful to everybody who came, and hospitality was a big deal back then.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the worst thing you could do was to be awful to strangers,
Yeah.
because people depended on the kindness of strangers.
Should we move on here?
All right. One passage in the Old Testament that seems to this about transgender people is in Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's apparel, for whoever does this is abhorrent to the Lord your God. Okay, so I actually found some quotes on this, but I don't need to go at length about the Old Testament laws. Don't continue into the Old Testament. This is particularly true about laws pertaining to mixing things. This is also kind of like in the Genesis with the sea and the land and the light and the dark. But there are also rules about not mixing things, like not having a shirt with more than two kinds of fabric, like not allowing the Canaanites into the temple, not cooking a lamb in its mother's milk. Okay, so cross-dressing is probably a major form of mixing. It's probably it's probably like they would have considered it a major form of mixing because it's male and female. Indeed, rabbinical interpretations of this law and cross-dressing are all over the map. I also want to point out that and this is a kind of a second thing. There are many instances of people changing their names in the Bible. Sometimes God says, like how Sarai became Sarah and Jacob became Israel. And so there is this pattern of people changing things. And then, like, sometimes God will call people by a new name. Like he'll say, oh, I've called you by a new name. And this is significant because it's okay for someone to change what we're born with. This is also even more the case with biblical attitudes towards eunuchs. And then we also discuss this in one of your sermons about how eunuchs became later accepted, and I think it was Isaiah.
Yeah, one of the things I recently read about the cross-dressing is they said, wait a minute, we're talking about definitions of men and women's clothing from 3,000 years ago in the Middle East in the desert. Does this really have anything to do with us today? If any of you women are wearing pants,
Yep.
you're cross-dressing. You're cross-dressing right now. And it's also interesting to realize that, like, there's probably a cultural thing. They're not entirely sure what it is, but there could have been things about like sneakiness, or like maybe something happened where a man dressed up in women's clothing and snuck through and got through something, and so they made this law. Nope, can't do that. We just don't know the context behind some of these laws. is this something Jesus would have cared about? Is a great
Yeah.
Yeah.
frame of reference.
What would Jesus do?
What would Jesus do? Did he care this much about this? Is this the heart of the law? No.
Yeah.
So once again, you can pull verses out of the Bible to try to shut down an argument, but always, what did it mean in its time, and does it have value for us today?
And I think you're right, Pastor, on that deal. When I think that maybe what they were worried about was deceitfulness in certain things. So, guy dressing up as a woman to try to do something or like that and stuff. I mean, come on, man. We're talking about a piece of clothing.
Yeah.
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 And when you look at pictures, aren't they kind of the same? Aren't they all
Yeah,
wearing
I
the
know.
same?
Yeah.
The differences are probably very subtle, like, oh, clearly that's a women's garment, and we'd be like, okay.
I'll take your word for it.
Look, like if they looked at the costumes we wear for the play, they could be horrified because we're
What are
not
you wearing?
representing the culture in any way, shape, or form, right? They're like, that's what the Canaanites wore, like,
Yeah, right.
it's just so removed from our understanding.
Remember, they have to be changed every 4 years to keep fashion and
That's
money
right,
circulating.
yeah,
we
are
I'm sure
way
we're
out
It's
of
an
fashion.
economic
I
thing.
think the largest contradiction for this is just the whole. I mean, when back in the Garden of Eden, God was like, "Why are you wearing these
Yeah.
leaves? I mean,
Good point.
you're,
Yes.
I created you to be naked," and they're like, "But it was wrong." It's like, God,
That's a
but
feminine
God-
leaf that guy's wearing.
Yeah.
God was not intending clothes at all in his original plans.
Yeah.
They hadn't learned how to make fabric yet.
Yeah.
That's right.
Beautiful.
Well, let's move on in the
All right.
interest of time.
All right. Okay. Then there are these two passages in Leviticus. Okay, I'm gonna kind of stop halfway in here because it's a long thing. You shall not lie with a man as with a woman, as it is an abomination. That's 1822. If a man lies with a man as with a woman, then both of them have committed an abomination. That's also Leviticus 20:13. First, it is unusual for abomination in the Old Testament to be permitted in the New Testament, but it does happen. Christians are definitely not bound by kosher food laws. Christ explicitly lifted them in Mark 7, but unkosher food is an abomination in the Old Testament. Abomination in the Old Testament can be truly bad things like murder, ritually impure things like unkosher food, or some combination of the two. So it's not, just some people would argue that just because it's an abomination, that it's just, or whatever the word they use in Hebrew for it, that it's like just, oh, it's so bad that it can't be lifted or something, but that's not true. One striking thing here, that there's nothing in the Old Testament except a creation story that even hints at lesbianism as being bad. This is really odd, given what appears to be such a strong rebuke of male homosexuality. And that's I thought that was really interesting. Why this contrast? One explanation of it is the Hebrew word zakar, which can be either a single male or male society that is kind of male kind. And then Colby Martin goes into this at length, explaining how this argument works, but the term is used in both Leviticus passages. For a man shall not lie with many men, zakar, as with a woman, it is an abomination. And then it goes. They use the same word in both passages, zakar. That is to say, it is a ban on men having multiple partners. Doesn't make sense of the lack of reference to lesbianism, as women tend to not have multiple partners anyways, whereas men often do have them. This is not, of course, how the Hebrews seem to have interpreted these two passages. Jesus does often argue that his people misinterpreted many things. So, that's not how the Hebrews went about it, but they had all these things about the Sabbath and stuff. No, you're not understanding how the Sabbath works, and they misinterpreted the Torah, or even like the Sermon on the Mount is like misinterpret. No, you didn't understand what the Torah meant and like that. It also might imply that God had a hidden tolerance for homosexuality from the very beginning.
Had a hidden what?
Tolerance.
Okay. One of the things I remember in seminary, which I thought was fantastic, is ostriches are an abomination because they're a flightless bird. They do not fit into that binary category, and so a lot of things, like kosher laws, meant that people would eat in certain categories, and so if it straddled the category, like salamanders go both in the water and out of the water, they're an abomination. They're not kosher. You can't eat them. So we think of that word as being like this big, scary word, but really it was part of the worldview of them separating things out to try to make sense of their world. So that's one thing.
What's the problem with pigs too? Because they have cloven hooves, but they don't chew their cud.
Yeah. So pigs they don't fit in the category. They're unclean. I also heard that in this time in which this was being written, families would kind of all sleep together in a tent. And if we keep reading, there's a lot more than just God caring about man lying with, there's, you shall not lie with your mother-in-law, with your daughter, with your, it's basically sort of like, if everyone's sleeping together in a tent, sometimes the guy who is in charge of the family might just sort of move his way around the tent. And that was sort of maybe seen as the problem of, keep it to the confined, people that are supposed to be.
That might have been the real problem.
That might have been the real problem, was taking advantage of and using your power to sort of have whoever you wanted to have rather than it being sort of a consensual relationship. So if you read the whole long list of what's not allowed, it's so much more than just what this has been pulled out to be. And I also just want to put this plug in. The church has been so concerned about this verse and homosexuality when we know how much regular heterosexual sexual abuse happens, from incest to sexual assault to other things that are deeply damaging. And for so long, the church has said virtually nothing about it.
Well, even homosexual abuse in the church.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we've focused on this one thing to the leaving out of things that are actually happening way more often and are harmful rather than what we imagine. And I've noticed that a lot, is it's like we have this window peeping morality. What are they doing in that bedroom, to judge them, but we're not actually paying attention to the things that are really hurting people. So I'm just going to say that.
Okay. In fact, the preponderance of references to homosexuality in the Old Testament, not all of them, are to homosexual cult prostitution.
That's interesting.
There's just a couple quotes here. I actually list all of them, but I quoted a couple. None of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute. None of the sons of Israel shall be a cult prostitute. That's in Deuteronomy 23:17. And Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and there were male cult prostitutes in the land. They did all according to the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Okay. And it goes on to Kings. I think that the outline just has the list of them. My point is that one is hard-pressed to find equal examples of two men having a relationship. I mean, I don't think there are any, actually. Even the acts of Sodom and Gomorrah were communal in their own brutal way. It's just, there's just none. The conservative scholar Robert Gagnon has tried to explain this away, saying Mesopotamian evidence makes clear that the most acceptable form of same-sex intercourse, not the least acceptable, was precisely the same-sex intercourse conducted in a religious context, Otherwise, for a man to be penetrated by another man would generally be regarded as disgraceful. So that's what this guy is saying. But that's to say, ancient Judaism was a response, according to Buddhism, of Mesopotamian assumptions about homosexuality. But the homosexuality is Gagnon strikes me as a formidable scholar, but his own evidence is a little less than a home run. In his book, Cult Prostitution is given deference in Mesopotamian culture, but not in an extreme way. Okay, so that's the first problem. So it's like there's this, and I find it more convincing that even if ancient Israel showed some privilege to cult prostitution to regular casual sex, the opposite was true of God. Cult prostitution was associated with idolatry, which God was and is adamantly against. I barely need to cite examples of this, but one is in Deuteronomy 18:9-11. When you come into the land which your Lord God has given you, you shall not follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his sons as an offering, or charmer, or medium, or necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. In light of God's negative view of idolatry, it is hard to imagine that the Bible considered cult prostitution too much safer than casual sex. Okay, so it's kind of a mouthful, but the point is that the references are almost all to cult prostitution, and that is probably the worst form in God's eyes too. Yeah, it's just kind of so it's very different than like what we're talking about. Okay, moving on to the New Testament, we have the witness of Jesus. And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by saying, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. They are no longer two, but one flesh." Jesus himself seems to be supporting the binary concept of marriage here, just as I was arguing against. That's what I was arguing against in interpreting the Genesis passage before. However, Jesus himself also immediately gives 3 exceptions to this marriage rule, elaborating on divorce. And then the disciple said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, Not everyone can interpret this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is actually giving lots of exceptions to this marriage rule that at first seemed absolute. Also significant is his positive use of the concept of a eunuch. In one of your sermons, you talked about Leviticus. We already talked about this, but Leviticus 21 and Isaiah 56:3. In the entire New Testament passage, eunuch is never a bad thing. That's really interesting. The sense to support the transgender movement. After all, if it is okay to be castrated, surely it is okay not to modify one's body in other ways. Like much of the Gospels, I think even more can be found in this rich passage, but this gets into the realm of personal conjecture. I think this is really a loaded passage to study. It's probably most positive actual passage towards it in like the whole Bible, I think. But
so what I see when Jesus says, he quotes Genesis and says, male and female, and the two shall become one flesh. The reason he's quoting this is not to enforce the binary of genders, rather that women were seen as property and they were easily cast aside, and only men could divorce women. Women didn't have any power. So if women are seen as less than human, property that can be discarded, when Jesus brings this up and says, a man shall leave his father and hold fast and they become one flesh, he's talking about honoring the woman. He's talking about marriage being a sacred relationship, not a business arrangement with a piece of property. So this is a very, in my opinion, feminist statement that is not to be used against to say, oh, you know, two women couldn't get married because Jesus said. This is about how we treat others. And then this interesting passage later then when Jesus keeps talking about the eunuchs, basically there's many reasons why eunuchs become eunuchs, but they were kind of looked down by some people, by the Jewish people, and yet Jesus says that they're a good thing, right? That he basically is inclusive of them, and that would have been an interesting message for people. In that way, I think, as you were insinuating with transgenderism, that it wouldn't be a huge issue, this idea of your body being modified or whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right, and the first chapter of Romans is also one of the more challenging passages regarding the being supportive of the whole LGBTQIA, but especially homosexuality. Often requires some historical background. I'm going to directly quote one scholar, Matthew Vines, a few times in this section, who wrote God and the Gay Christian. Regarding idolatry, Paul writes, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions for their women, exchanged natural relations to that which was contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, receiving for themselves a due penalty for their error." And that's Romans 1. Note that Paul is critiquing these actions on two grounds. First, that they are unnatural, and second, that they are shameful. Second, the passage is more about the consequences of idolatry than sexual issues per se. In regard to being unnatural, Vines ties this to gender roles in the first century. To quote, "In the ancient world, if a man took the active role in sex, his behavior was deemed to be natural." Okay, so that meant but if he took the passive role, he was derided for engaging in unnatural sex. Opposite was true of women. Sexual passivity was termed unnatural, while sexual dominance was considered unnatural. So, and likewise, an understanding of so first of all, it's like being passive or active. You know, it was natural for man. So that sounds like, well, how can that be natural? I mean, that's what I mean when I understand natural. But understanding of the labels natural and unnatural as referring to cultural conventions is further supported by the uses of the Greek word, which reflect ancient custom. So he's saying that the terms natural and unnatural weren't really what we think of the words as like biology, but they refer to like cultural conventions, and that was how they were used. And so it is kind of different because you have to bring in like a scholar to understand this a lot. But
if I can jump in, some of the practices that were normal we would consider horrific. And for example, in the Greek world, the man was the head of the household. He was the dominator, and he literally, this would be a phrase they use, he did sex to his wife. They didn't have it together.
No.
He did it to her. He was the active, she was the passive. And he could do that to anyone, a slave, whatever, and that would be natural. But if for some reason she took an active, remember, married couple, she took an active role and he, was just sort of passive lying there, that's unnatural. So once again, you have to understand the cultural context, and we are throwing so much of our modern understanding and assuming that's what everybody else was thinking. So the words natural and unnatural meant something very different for Paul than they do for us. And we would not, as women, we would not want to go back in time.
Yes.
It's the norm.
And,
It's a norm for the
the
male
norm.
to do this and a norm for the woman
Exactly.
to do that. And whether it's right or wrong or indifferent.
Exactly. So what
This-
Paul is talking about and bothered by is completely different from what we would be seeing.
This last bullet point about consumed with passion for one another is very important too, because to the Romans in particular, moderation was very, very important, and they felt that anything done in excess was a sign of moral decay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the belief was that it was normal for a man to be passionate about a woman, but if he had so much passion, it started to spill over. And then now he is passionate for men too. And they're like, well, that's excessive.
Yeah.
Rein it back in, my friend. You know, just like someone eating too many cakes. It was the same sort of belief. Obviously, we think very different. We talk about orientations, you know, sexual orientation. We have had so much more conversation and study about this now than, and it's just a completely different world. And so, you know, gay men would laugh and say, no, it isn't that I started with women and got so excited I moved on to men.
Yeah.
Women, you do nothing for me, and you never have and you never
Yeah.
will. You know, it's just we understand differently than how they were seeing things. Hey, we're doing really well.
Yeah,
Last
very good.
one. We're going to do it.
All right. Okay, finally, there are passages that suggest gay people won't get into heaven. These hint on two obscure Greek words, malakoi and arsenokoitai. Know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor the effeminate, malakoi, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thief, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. Again, that's 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. Regarding the term malakoi, Vines writes, some men who engage in same-sex behavior were considered to be malakoi, specifically men who willingly submitted to penetration. On that basis, many biblical translators in recent decades have translated it as a term to condemn homosexuality, or at least as a condemnation of men who take a passive role in a same-sex relationship. Okay, now this is Vines, God and Gay Christian. But there was a problem with this interpretation. First, most uses of the word malakos were not related to sexual behavior. But even if we look at the word sexual uses, passive same-sex behavior, it is still not the word's very likely meaning. The word malakos was actually more frequently applied to men who succumb to the charms of women. Okay, so it's okay.
So men who allowed themselves to be seduced by women were effeminate.
They were
Yeah.
passive again.
Yeah,
That's
The
very
cultural
different.
context of the
Oh, yeah,
time.
very oh, of course.
That's very different.
yeah. And the term arsenokoitai was even more rare. Some believe Paul invented the word. It seems to be a compound of arsen, and meaning male, and koite, meaning bed. Best guess is that this again goes back in a loose way toward a Greek translation of the Leviticus passage, which we talked about earlier. But its actual meaning is obscure. It's taken from Pastor Kobe Martin's book on Clobber. Okay, honestly, my knowledge of Hebrew translations into Greek to form Greek portmanteaus is pretty limited, so I'll have to take his word for it. He argues that it is the same issue discussed before, that the term refers to sex with multiple partners rather than homosexuality per se. Okay, so this is so that's his argument. So it's I mean, our best guess is that it's like it's a created word that uses, I think it's Septuagint, was it that was called? Septuagint, yeah. That like there was some version of that of the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek that used the word arsen and koiti, and that's where he got the word. But we really don't know for sure. You know, it's a very rare word, and yeah, it's just people are just guessing where the word comes from. It's almost never used.
I also heard that one of these words here could mean, maybe it's the arsenokoitai, it might talk about men who buy boys for sex. And so none of this is talking about mutual consensual loving relationships. None of them are referring to that. I feel like almost any time sexual stuff is brought up, it's usually where there's some sort of abuse or taking advantage of something like that, mixed in with cultural norms and what people saw. And so it's, again, the Bible is a historical book that's so removed from our time and culture. It's really hard for us to understand exactly what they were looking at and talking about. And for me, it always comes back to, if you don't know the culture and you have these handful of verses, but what was Jesus's main message? What did he talk about over and over again?
What would anger him?
Right. This wasn't anything he talked about, but over and over again, it was about respecting people and let the little children come to me, and no, don't stone that woman, and it was he was shifting a focus to more of how we treat other people here. And so it's always baffling to me that it's so much easier as a Christian to point at what everyone else is doing wrong than it is, as John says, you point one finger out, you got three more pointing it back at you.
There you go.
To look back at the log in your own eye,
Yeah.
which is what Jesus directed us to do.
Yeah.
Do this first.
Yeah.
So
I believe that the majority of sex back then was, there was one dominant person. He took whatever he wanted. And it didn't matter what sex he wanted, or, I mean, whatever. And that was, for back then, it'd probably been pretty rare if you could have had a loving relationship, because everything was done on this pyramid of power. You know, if you were there, you could take what you wanted, and so that's what I think a lot of this stuff's all about.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it was very important to have children.
Yes.
Well, that's it.
Wow.
I was
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
at
That's
saying.
your retirement
Children
fund.
died, the
That's
mothers
right.
died, you had to have enough people to keep your clan going.
Yeah.
Exactly, and so I like your explanation of the flamingo. It doesn't fit. So what we're after. This is our goal,
Yeah.
to populate and
Yeah.
to dominate and whatever, and so it doesn't fit. So
Yep.
throw it out the back.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for
thank
staying.
you.